Captain Jake Morrison stared at the tactical screen on the bridge of the USS Defiant. The display showed hundreds of green dots representing the largest human fleet ever assembled. 230 ships floated in formation above the planet. New Providence. Each ship carried thousands of crew members who had volunteered for what everyone knew was a suicide mission. Morrison rubbed his tired eyes. He had been awake for 36 hours straight, preparing for this battle. The Korathian Empire had swept across the galaxy like a plague for 300 years. Their biomechanical ships could adapt to any weapon fired at them. They learned from every battle and became stronger each time they won. "Captain, we're receiving a transmission from Admiral Grant," said Communications Officer Billy Thompson. His voice was steady, but Morrison could hear the fear underneath. "Put her through," Morrison replied. Admiral Lisa Grant's face appeared on the main screen. She looked older than her 50 years, worn down by the endless war against the Korathians. Behind her, Morrison could see the bridge of the USS Washington, humanity's most powerful battleship. "All ships, this is Admiral Grant. Today we make our stand. The colony world of New Providence has 3 million civilians who are counting on us. We will not let them down. All ships prepare for battle formation Delta." Morrison felt his stomach tighten. He had read the reports from previous battles. The Korathians had destroyed the Centauri defense fleet in 4 hours. The Vegan Alliance had lasted only 2 hours before their ships were turned into floating wreckage. The pattern was always the same. The aliens would emerge from hyperspace, adapt to whatever weapons were fired at them, and then systematically destroy every enemy ship. "Sir, hyperspace signatures detected," announced Navigation Officer Helen Cruz. "Multiple contacts bearing 32 Mark 7. Morrison gripped the arms of his captain's chair. "All hands, battle stations. This is not a drill." The alarm klaxons echoed through the Defiant's corridors. 320 crew members rushed to their positions. In the engine room, Chief Engineer Kate Phillips checked her reactor readings one final time. In the medical bay, Dr. Amanda Foster prepared for the wounded that would soon fill her beds. The Korathian fleet emerged from hyperspace like something from a nightmare. Their ships were massive, dark hulls that seemed to pulse and breathe. Bioluminescent patterns ran along their surfaces like veins carrying alien blood. The largest vessel was the size of a small moon, its surface covered in what looked like living tissue. "Dear God," whispered Lieutenant Commander Rick Barnes, the tactical officer. "There are so many of them." Morrison counted at least 50 Korathian ships. Each one was larger than the biggest human vessel, but it was not their size that made them terrifying. It was their ability to learn and adapt. Human weapons that worked in one battle became useless in the next. "All ships, commence attack pattern Delta," Admiral Grant's voice crackled over the comm. "Fire at will." The human fleet opened fire. Plasma cannons blazed across the void. Kinetic missiles streaked toward the alien ships. Antimatter torpedoes left trails of fire in their wake. For a moment, it looked like the attack might work. Several Korathian vessels staggered under the massive barrage. Then the aliens began to adapt. Morrison watched in horror as the Korathian ships' hulls began to change. The biomechanical surfaces rippled and shifted. Within minutes, the plasma fire that had been burning through their armor was being absorbed harmlessly. The kinetic missiles bounced off hulls that had somehow become harder than diamond. The antimatter torpedoes exploded uselessly against shields that had not existed moments before. "They're learning," Dr. Foster said from her position at the science station. "Their ships are actually evolving in real time." The Korathian counterattack was swift and brutal. Bioelectric tendrils reached out from their ships like living whips. Where they touched human vessels, the metal hulls began to dissolve. Crew members screamed as sections of their ships simply melted away. The USS Boston was the first to die. Morrison watched as the heavy cruiser's hull was eaten away by some kind of acid. The ship broke apart, spilling atmosphere and crew into the vacuum of space. Then the USS Denver followed, its reactor core breached by a weapon that seemed to phase through its armor. "Sir, we're losing ships fast," Barnes reported. His voice was tight with fear. "The Washington is taking heavy damage." On the main screen, Morrison could see Admiral Grant's flagship. The massive battleship was surrounded by Korathian vessels like wolves around a wounded deer. Bioelectric tendrils wrapped around the Washington's hull, slowly crushing it. "All ships break formation and scatter," Admiral Grant ordered. Her voice was strained. "Save yourselves. That's an order." Morrison felt sick. The greatest human fleet in history was being destroyed in less than 2 hours. Ships that had taken years to build were being torn apart in minutes. Good people he had served with for decades were dying all around him. "Captain, what are your orders?" asked Helen Cruz. Morrison looked at his crew. They were all staring at him, waiting for his decision. He could order the Defiant to retreat like the other surviving ships. It would be the smart thing to do. The logical thing to do. But Jake Morrison had never been known for making logical decisions. "Sir, the Washington is breaking up," Barnes reported. Morrison watched as Admiral Grant's flagship came apart. The proud battleship that had served humanity for 20 years was reduced to glowing debris in seconds. 3,000 crew members gone in an instant. The Korathian fleet began to move toward New Providence. Soon their biomechanical ships would be in orbit above the defenseless colony. 3 million civilians would die, just like on dozens of other worlds. Morrison stood up from his captain's chair. His decision was made. "All hands, this is the captain. We are not retreating. Engineering, give me everything the reactor can handle. All remaining power to engines and weapons, sir." Kate Phillips' voice came over the intercom from the engine room. "That will push us past safe limits." "I don't care about safe limits, Chief. I need full power now." Morrison turned to his tactical officer. "Rick, plot a course straight through the center of their formation. We're going to ram the biggest ship they have." Barnes stared at him. "Sir, that's suicide." "Maybe, but if we're going to die, we're taking as many of them with us as possible." "Helm, set course for the Korathian flagship. Maximum speed." The Defiant turned toward the alien fleet. Her engines flared to life, pushing the old cruiser faster than she had ever gone before. The ship shuddered as systems strained beyond their limits. "All hands, prepare for ramming speed," Morrison announced. "It has been an honor serving with all of you." As the Defiant accelerated toward the massive Korathian vessel, Morrison thought about the 3 million people on New Providence. They deserved better than this. They deserved to live. If his ship could buy them even a few more hours, maybe some of them could escape. The alien flagship grew larger on the screen. Its biomechanical surface pulsed with alien life. Weapon ports opened along its hull like eyes waking from sleep. In seconds, the Defiant would be within range of those terrible weapons. Morrison gripped his chair and prepared to die. But he was determined to make his death count for something. The Korathians had broken every fleet they had ever fought. But they had never fought Jake Morrison and the crew of the USS Defiant. The old cruiser raced toward her destiny, carrying the hopes of humanity in her battered hull. The USS Defiant was not a beautiful ship. She was 40 years old and had been scheduled for retirement before the Korathian crisis began. Her hull was scarred with battle damage from a dozen different wars. Paint was peeling from her outer plates, and her engines made strange noises when pushed too hard. But Captain Jake Morrison loved the old cruiser. She had been his home for 8 years, and her crew of 320 souls had become his family. They were veterans all, men and women who had seen too much war to be afraid of death. Chief Engineer Kate Phillips stood in the engine room. watching her displays turn red as the reactor pushed past safe limits. She was 52 years old and had served on 17 different ships during her career. She had never seen readings this high before. "Captain," she called over the intercom, "I can give you full power for maybe 20 minutes before we start cooking ourselves. The reactor wasn't designed for this kind of stress." 20 minutes will have to be enough, Chief," Morrison replied from the bridge. "Just keep us moving." Kate wiped sweat from her forehead. The engine room was getting hot as the reactor worked overtime. Around her, her engineering team worked with quiet efficiency. They all knew they were probably going to die in the next few minutes, but they did their jobs anyway. Lieutenant Commander Rick Barnes sat at his tactical station, calculating firing solutions. The math was simple and brutal. One human cruiser against 50 Korathian ships. The odds were impossible. But Rick had been in impossible situations before. He had survived the Battle of Wolf 359 when he was just a young lieutenant. He had learned that sometimes impossible odds just meant you had to be more creative. "Captain, I've got targeting solutions on the lead ships," Rick reported. "But sir, our weapons won't do much damage. They'll adapt within minutes." "Then we'll have to make those minutes count," Morrison said. "Fire everything we have." The Defiant opened up with all her weapons. Plasma cannons blazed from her forward batteries. Missile tubes launched their deadly cargo in rapid succession. The ship's main gun, a massive rail cannon that could punch through a mountain, fired round after round at the Korathian flagship. But something strange happened. Instead of adapting immediately like they always did, the Korathian ships seemed confused. Their biomechanical hulls flickered and pulsed erratically. The massive flagship actually staggered under the Defiant's fire. Dr. Amanda Foster was monitoring the enemy ships from the bridge science station. She was a medical doctor, not a scientist, but the ship's regular science officer had been killed in a previous battle. She watched the readings with growing excitement. "Captain, something's wrong with their adaptation process," she said. "The biological signatures are all over the place. It's like they can't figure out how to respond." Morrison frowned. "What do you mean?" "Their ships are designed to analyze our tactics and evolve countermeasures. But our attack pattern isn't following any logical strategy. We're supposed to be retreating or trying to escape, not charging straight at them." The Korathian ships were firing back now, but their aim was poor. Bioelectric tendrils reached out for the Defiant, but the nimble cruiser dodged between them. Morrison ordered evasive maneuvers that made no tactical sense, and somehow they worked. Navigation Officer Helen Cruz had been plotting courses for 15 years, but she had never been asked to do anything like this. "Coming about to bearing 2-7 Mark IV, she announced as the Defiant dove beneath a massive Korathian dreadnought. The alien ship's weapons tried to track them, but the unexpected maneuver caught them off guard. "Now climb and fire as we pass," Morrison ordered. The Defiant shot upward like a rocket, emerging from beneath the enemy ship and opening fire at point-blank range. The Korathian vessel's adaptive plating flickered frantically, unable to evolve. A defense against an attack from directly below. Communications Officer Billy Thompson was listening to the alien communications channels. His universal translator was having trouble with the bioelectric signals, but he could make out enough to understand that the Korathians were confused. "Sir, they're trying to categorize our behavior," Billy reported. "I'm hearing words that translate to illogical and unpredictable over and over again." Morrison smiled grimly. "Good. Let's give them more to think about." The Defiant continued her impossible dance through the Korathian formation. Morrison ordered attacks that violated every rule of space combat. They would retreat when they should attack, charge when they should run, and fire at targets that made no strategic sense. The alien ship's biomechanical systems were overloading, trying to adapt to human unpredictability. Their evolutionary programming was designed to counter logical military tactics, not the chaotic improvisation of desperate humans. Other human ships began to notice what was happening. The USS Colorado, commanded by Captain Steve Walsh, had been fleeing toward the edge of the system when her sensors detected the Defiant's impossible survival. "Navigation, bring us about," Walsh ordered. "We're going back." "Sir, that's suicide," his first officer protested. "Maybe, but if Morrison can make them confused, maybe we can too." The Colorado turned back toward the battle, followed by the USS Memphis and a dozen other ships that should have been running for their lives. They had all seen the tactical data from the Defiant's engagement. Somehow, one stubborn human ship was making the invincible Carathians look foolish. Captain Walsh decided to try something that no sane military officer would attempt. He ordered his ship to ram through a Carathian vessel's adaptive shielding, while firing all weapons at once. The enemy ship's biomechanical systems tried to adapt to the kinetic impact, the energy weapons, and the explosive damage all simultaneously. The alien ship's evolutionary matrix couldn't handle multiple contradictory stimuli. Its hull began to ripple and change in conflicting patterns. Within seconds, the biomechanical systems overloaded completely. The Carathian vessel literally tore itself apart as its adaptive programming went haywire. "It worked," Walsh breathed. In amazement, the damn thing killed itself trying to adapt. Word of the breakthrough spread through the surviving human ships. Captains who had been preparing to die suddenly found themselves with a new weapon, their own humanity. The USS Phoenix tried the berserk run that Captain Dan Miller had just invented. His ship deliberately damaged its own systems to create unpredictable energy signatures. The Carathian vessels couldn't figure out how to adapt to a ship that was constantly changing its own configuration. The USS Montana, under Captain Susan Taylor, developed what she called the Chaos Formation. Her squadron of destroyers flew in patterns that looked completely random, but were actually coordinated through pure human intuition. The alien ship's tactical computers couldn't predict where they would be from 1 second to the next. Back on the Defiant, Morrison watched the tide of battle slowly turning. The Carathian flagship was still massive and dangerous, but its bioelectric weapons were missing more often than they hit. The alien ship's adaptive systems were struggling to counter an enemy that refused to behave logically. "Chief, how are we doing on power?" Morrison asked. "Reactors holding steady, but we're way past safe limits," Kate replied. "I can keep this up for maybe another 10 minutes before something critical fails. Then we better make those 10 minutes count." Morrison turned to his tactical officer. "Rick, I want you to plot the most insane attack run you can think of. Something so stupid that even we think it's crazy." Rick Barnes grinned. For the first time in hours, he was actually enjoying himself. "I think I have just the thing, sir." The Defiant began her final approach toward the Carathian flagship. But instead of the expected ramming attack, she suddenly flipped end over end and began flying backward while firing all weapons. The massive alien ship's targeting systems couldn't cope with a vessel that was flying in reverse while shooting. Morrison laughed as he watched the enemy's confusion. Humanity had spent centuries trying to be more logical, more predictable, more like the other advanced species in the galaxy. But their greatest strength had always been their ability to do the unexpected. The old cruiser that wouldn't die had found the key to victory in the most human trait of all: stubborn refusal to accept defeat when defeat made perfect sense. The battle above New Providence had been raging for 3 hours. What started as a massacre had turned into something the galaxy had never seen before. Human ships were not just surviving against the Carathians, they were winning. Captain Jake Morrison stood on the bridge of the USS Defiant, watching his tactical display with amazement. The green dots representing human ships were dancing through the red dots of the Carathian fleet like children playing tag. Every time an alien ship tried to adapt to human tactics, the humans would do something completely different. "Sir, we're getting reports from all over the battle zone," Communications Officer Billy Thompson said. "The USS Phoenix just destroyed 2 Korathian cruisers by ramming them while spinning like a top. The Montana Squadron is flying in figure-8 patterns that are making the enemy ships dizzy." Morrison shook his head in wonder. "How are we doing?" "This?" Dr. Amanda Foster looked up from her science station. She had been studying the Korathian biosignatures for hours, trying to understand what was happening. "Captain, I think I know. The Korathian ships are designed to fight logical enemies. They analyze attack patterns, predict movements, and evolve counters. But we're not being logical." "Explain," Morrison said. "Their biomechanical systems are like giant brains that can think very fast. But they can only think in straight lines. They expect enemies to do things that make sense from a military standpoint. When we charge straight at them instead of running away, their brains get confused." Lieutenant Commander Rick Barnes nodded from his tactical station. "It's like trying to solve a math problem when someone keeps changing the rules. They can't adapt to chaos because chaos has no pattern to learn from." The proof was all around them. The Korathian flagship, which had seemed unstoppable an hour ago, was now missing chunks of its biomechanical hull. Its adaptive plating kept trying to counter human weapons, but every time it evolved a defense, the humans would switch to a completely different attack method. Navigation Officer Helen Cruz was plotting another impossible course. "Captain, requesting permission to try something really stupid." "Granted," Morrison said without hesitation. "Stupid seems to be working for us." Helen programmed a flight path that would take the Defiant through the inside of a Korathian formation, then loop back and attack from the opposite direction. It was the kind of maneuver that would get a pilot court-martialed in peacetime. But these were not peaceful times. The Defiant dove into the enemy formation like a fish swimming upstream. Korathian weapons fired all around them, but the alien ships couldn't coordinate their attacks. Each vessel was trying to adapt to the human ship's presence, but they were getting in each other's way. "Their coordination is breaking down," Amanda observed. "They're so focused on adapting to us individually that they're not working together as a fleet anymore." Chief Engineer Kate Phillips called from the engine room. "Captain, I've got an idea. What if we deliberately overload some of our systems? Make our energy signature so chaotic that their sensors can't get a lock on us?" "Do it," Morrison ordered. "But don't blow us up in the process." Kate began shutting down and restarting various systems in random patterns. The Defiant's energy signature became a flickering mess that changed every few seconds. The Korathian ships trying to target them were like hunters trying to shoot a ghost. The tactic spread to other human ships. Soon the entire human fleet was deliberately creating system malfunctions to confuse the enemy. The USS Colorado was flying with half its engines offline, making it wobble unpredictably through space. The USS Denver was flickering its shields on and off, creating a strobe effect that overloaded Korathian targeting computers. Captain Steve Walsh of the Colorado was enjoying himself for the first time in months. "Navigation, I want you to plot a course that spells out hello in the middle of their formation." "Sir, that's completely insane," his navigator replied. "Perfect, do it." The Colorado began flying in loops and curves, actually writing letters in space with its flight path. The Korathian ships tried to predict where it would go next. But how do you predict someone who is writing words in three-dimensional space? Meanwhile, the USS Memphis under Captain Lisa Rodriguez was trying something even more bizarre. She ordered her gunners to fire their weapons in musical patterns, creating rhythms with their plasma cannons. The Korathian ship's adaptive systems tried to find tactical meaning in the musical attacks, but there was none to find. "They're trying to analyze our music," Rodriguez laughed. "I wonder what they think of our taste in battle songs." The Korathian fleet was in chaos. Their biomechanical ships were adapting so rapidly to human unpredictability that they were starting to malfunction. Some vessels were growing extra armor in random places. Others were sprouting weapons that pointed in the wrong directions. The largest Korathian ship, the one Morrison had originally planned to ram, was having the worst problems. Its adaptive systems were trying to evolve counters to dozens of different human tactics at once. The biomechanical hull was rippling and changing like a living thing having a seizure. "Sir, that big ship is in trouble," Rick Barnes reported. "Its bioelectric readings are all over the place. I think its adaptation system is overloading." Morrison studied the massive vessel. It was still dangerous, but its weapons were firing randomly now instead of at specific targets. Its hull was covered in conflicting adaptations, thick armor. Next to thin spots, weapons pointing in every direction, shield generators that were interfering with each other. "Billy, can you translate what they're saying?" Morrison asked. Billy Thompson listened to the alien communications for a moment. "Sir, they're asking for help. The big ship is transmitting distress signals to the rest of their fleet." "Distress signals?" "Yes, sir. They're saying their adaptation matrix is failing. They can't process human behavior patterns. They're requesting new programming from their home fleet." Morrison felt a surge of hope. How long before they get help? "Their nearest reinforcements are at least 6 hours away, sir." 6 hours. The human fleet had 6 hours to finish what they had started. Morrison opened a channel to all human ships. "This is Captain Morrison of the USS Defiant. We've got them confused and scared. Now we finish this. All ships, attack pattern crazy. I repeat, attack pattern crazy. Do whatever you think will confuse them the most." The human fleet responded with enthusiasm. The USS Phoenix began flying in corkscrews while firing in all directions. The USS Montana started playing music over loudspeakers while shooting at random targets. The USS Colorado began ramming smaller Korathian ships just to see what would happen. The Korathian adaptation began to completely break down. Their ships were evolving so rapidly that they were becoming unstable. Some vessels were growing so much extra armor that they couldn't move. Others were sprouting so many weapons that they couldn't generate enough power to fire them all. The biggest breakthrough came when Lieutenant Colonel Frank Cooper arrived with his fighter squadron. His pilots had been trained in standard combat tactics, but Cooper threw the rulebook out the window. "All right, people," he said over the squadron comm. "Forget everything you learned in flight school. We're going to fly like we're drunk, high, and having the time of our lives." The human fighters began weaving through the Korathian formation in patterns that made no sense. They would fly straight up, then suddenly dive down, then loop sideways while firing at nothing in particular. The alien interceptors trying to counter them were like dancers trying to follow music that kept changing tempo. One Korathian fighter actually crashed into its own mothership because it was so confused by a human pilot who was flying backward while doing barrel rolls. "This is the most fun I've had in years." Cooper laughed as he watched alien ships trying to adapt to his pilots. Insane flying. Who knew that terrible piloting could be a weapon? The tide of battle had completely turned. The humans were no longer fighting for survival. They were fighting for victory. And they were doing it by being more human than they had ever been. Before, the Korathian Empire had spent 3 centuries conquering the galaxy with logic and adaptation. But they had never encountered an enemy that could weaponize chaos itself. Morrison looked at his crew and smiled. They had found something that no military academy had ever taught. Sometimes the best strategy was to have no strategy at all. News of the battle above New Providence spread through the human fleet faster than hyperspace communications. What had started as Captain Jake, Morrison's desperate last stand, was becoming something that would change warfare for Admiral Carroll. Hayes commanded the reserve fleet from the outer edge of the system. She was 60 years old and had fought in more battles than she cared to remember. She had watched the main fleet get destroyed on her tactical screens, then watched in amazement as those same ships came back from the dead. "Ma'am, we're receiving tactical data from the battle zone," her communications officer reported. "The ships are, well, they're doing things that don't make sense." Admiral Hayes studied the data streaming in from Morrison's fleet. Ships were flying in patterns that violated every rule of space combat. They were attacking when they should retreat, clustering when they should spread out, and somehow it was working. "Get me Captain Morrison," she ordered. Morrison's face appeared on her screen. His uniform was torn, and there was a cut on his forehead, but he was smiling. Behind him, she could see his bridge crew working with desperate energy. "Admiral, good to see you're still alive," Morrison said. "We've discovered something important. The Carathians can't handle chaos. Their adaptation systems overload when we fight like humans instead of like machines." "Explain," Hayes said. "Their ships are designed to counter logical military tactics. But human behavior isn't logical. When we do things that make no sense, their biomechanical systems can't figure out how to respond." Hayes looked at her tactical display. Her reserve fleet consisted of 80 ships, most of them older vessels like Morrison's Defiant. They had been held back because they weren't considered powerful enough for the main battle. But if Morrison was right, power wasn't what mattered anymore. "All ships, this is Admiral Hayes," she announced to her fleet. "New orders. Forget everything you learned in military school. From now on, we fight like humans. Captain Morrison will explain what that means." Morrison's voice came over the fleet communication channel. "Listen up, everyone. The key is unpredictability. Do things that don't make tactical sense. Confuse the enemy so much that their adaptation systems break down. And whatever you do, don't give up. Stubbornness is our greatest weapon." Captain Dan Miller of the USS Phoenix had been developing new tactics throughout the battle. His ship had survived by deliberately damaging its own systems to create unpredictable energy patterns. Now he shared his discoveries with the reserve fleet. "Try the Berserk run," Miller explained. "Overload your engines until they smoke. Fire your weapons randomly. Make your ship look like it's broken, then attack when they least expect it." Captain Susan Taylor of the USS Montana had perfected the chaos formation with her destroyer squadron. "Fly in patterns that look random but feel right," she told the new arrivals. "Trust your instincts, not your computers. The aliens can predict computer logic, but they can't predict human intuition." The reserve fleet threw themselves into the battle with enthusiasm. Ships that had been considered too old or too weak suddenly became deadly weapons of confusion. The USS Hartford began flying in spirals while playing classical music over external speakers. The USS Richmond started firing fireworks instead of regular missiles, creating colorful explosions that overloaded Carathian visual sensors. The most successful new tactic came from Captain Jenny Walsh, who commanded a squadron of marine assault ships. Instead of trying to destroy Carathian vessels from the outside, she decided to get inside them. "All Marine units, prepare for boarding actions," Walsh announced. "We're going to dock with their ships and fight them hand to hand." Her Marines thought she was crazy. Nobody boarded Carathian vessels. Their biomechanical hulls were supposed to be impenetrable. But Walsh had noticed that the alien ships' adaptation systems were designed to repel external threats, not internal ones. The USS Intrepid, Walsh's flagship, flew straight at a medium-sized Carathian cruiser. Instead of firing weapons, the ship extended its docking clamps and grabbed onto the alien vessel's hull. The Carathian ship's adaptive systems went wild, trying to figure out what was happening. "They don't know how to handle physical contact," Walsh reported to Morrison. "Their hull is trying to adapt to repel us, but it's never dealt with a ship that wants to get closer instead of farther away." Marine Captain Tom Rodriguez led the first boarding party through the airlock. What they found inside the Korathian ship was unlike anything in human experience. The corridors were alive, pulsing with bioelectric energy. The walls seemed to breathe, and strange lights flickered in patterns that hurt to look at. "It's like being inside a giant organism," Rodriguez reported. "But the ship doesn't know how to fight us in here. Its immune system is designed for diseases and parasites, not armed Marines." The human boarding parties fought their way through the living ship room by room. Every time the biomechanical systems tried to adapt to their presence, the Marines would change tactics. They used flamethrowers in one corridor, ice weapons in another, and sometimes just threw rocks to confuse the adaptive responses. The Korathian crew were tall, pale beings with too many joints and eyes that glowed with bioelectric light. They fought with weapons that grew out of their hands, but they were not prepared for close-quarters combat with humans. Marines who had learned to fight in the dirty conflicts of human space brought tactics that no alien military academy had ever considered. "They're too polite," Sergeant Mary Johnson reported as she led her squad through a biomechanical laboratory. "They fight like they're following rules. We fight like we want to win." The Korathian ship's adaptation matrix began to shut down completely as human Marines spread through its interior. The biomechanical systems couldn't process the concept of an enemy that had intentionally entered the ship to fight at close range. It was like a computer trying to divide by zero. Meanwhile, in space, the main battle was reaching its climax. The massive Korathian flagship that had seemed invincible hours earlier was now completely disabled. Its biomechanical hull was covered in conflicting adaptations that were fighting each other. Some sections had grown thick armor, while others had become transparent. Weapons were sprouting randomly and firing at empty space dock. Captain Morrison decided it was time to finish what he had started. "All ships, final assault on the flagship. Let's show them what humans do when they're really angry." The entire human fleet converged on the massive alien vessel. But instead of a coordinated military attack, it was pure chaos. Ships fired from every direction while flying in impossible patterns. The USS Colorado rammed the flagship's hull while spinning like a drill. The USS Memphis began playing wedding music while firing plasma cannons in rhythm. The USS Defiant led the final charge. Morrison's old cruiser, battered and smoking from hours of impossible combat, flew straight toward the flagship's command section. But instead of the ramming attack that everyone expected, Morrison ordered his ship to dock gently with the alien vessel. "They're expecting us to crash into them," Morrison explained to his crew. "So let's do the opposite. Boarding party, prepare to take their bridge." Chief Engineer Kate Phillips had one last surprise for the Korathians. As the Defiant docked with the flagship, she began broadcasting human music through the ship's external speakers. Not battle songs or military marches, but children's lullabies and love songs. The effect on the Korathian flagship was immediate. Its biomechanical systems, already overloaded from trying to adapt to chaotic human tactics, couldn't process the concept of enemies who played gentle music while preparing to board. The massive ship's adaptation matrix finally collapsed completely. Morrison led the boarding party himself, walking through corridors that had stopped trying to defend themselves. The Korathian crew was found huddled in their command center, their bioelectric eyes dim with confusion. "We surrender," their commander said. In broken English, "We do not understand you. Your behavior has no logic. Our adaptation cannot function." Morrison looked at the alien commander with something almost like pity. "That's because you've been fighting other aliens all these years. You've never fought humans before. We don't make sense because making sense isn't always the best way to win." The Battle of New Providence was over. The most powerful Korathian fleet ever assembled had been defeated by tactics that no military computer could have predicted. Humanity had won not by becoming more like their enemies, but by being more human than ever before. 6 months after the Battle of New Providence, the galaxy was a very different place. The Korathian Empire, which had ruled through fear and superior adaptation for 3 centuries, had signed a peace treaty with humanity. More shocking to the rest of the galaxy was that they had done it willingly. Admiral Jake Morrison stood on the observation deck of the New Earth Defense Station, looking out at the strangest sight in military history. Human ships were flying in formation with vessels from a dozen different alien species, all practicing what the galaxy now called human doctrine. Morrison still found it hard to believe that he was an admiral. The promotion had come with a lot of ceremony and speeches about heroism, but he knew the truth. He had simply been too stubborn to give up when giving up made perfect sense. The USS Defiant floated nearby, fully repaired and upgraded. Chief Engineer Kate Phillips had rebuilt the old cruiser stronger than before, but she had kept some of the controlled chaos systems that had proven so effective against the Korathians. The ship could still make her engines smoke on purpose and create random energy patterns when needed. "Sir, the delegation from the Andromedan Republic is here for their training," reported Captain Helen Cruz, who had been promoted to Morrison's chief of staff. "They want to learn the spiral attack pattern." Morrison smiled. The Andromedans were a very logical species who valued precise military tactics. Teaching them to fight like chaotic humans was going to be interesting. The training facility on the Vacuum Station was unlike any military school in galactic history. Instead of neat classrooms and orderly demonstrations, it looked more like a playground. Ships flew in crazy patterns, while instructors shouted advice that sounded more like jokes than military strategy. "Remember," Captain Dan Miller was telling a group of alien pilots, "the key is to do something so stupid that even you think it's a bad idea. If it makes tactical sense, you're doing it wrong." Miller had become one of the leading experts on what they now called tactical unpredictability. His USS Phoenix had pioneered the Berserk Run, and he had written the manual on how to make your own ship look broken while still being deadly. Captain Susan Taylor was teaching the Chaos Formation to a group of very confused Centauri commanders. "Don't think about where you're going," she explained. "Feel where you should be. Trust your instincts, not your computers." The Centauri were having trouble with the concept. Their culture valued logic and planning above all else. The idea of flying by instinct rather than calculation was almost painful for them to consider. "But how do we coordinate without predetermined flight paths?" asked Commander Zethkar, a veteran Centauri officer with over 100 battles to his credit. "You don't coordinate," Taylor replied. "You harmonize. It's like dancing to music that hasn't been written yet." The Centauri commander's blue face showed complete bewilderment. In another part of the training center, Captain Jenny Walsh was teaching boarding tactics to a mixed group of human Marines and alien soldiers. The aliens were fascinated by the human concept of deliberately entering an enemy ship to fight at close range. "Most species try to destroy their enemies from a safe distance," Walsh explained. "Humans get up close and personal. We look them in the eye when we beat them." A Vegan Alliance officer raised a tentacled arm. "But is this not extremely dangerous? Why would you choose close combat when ranged weapons are available?" "Because it's the last thing they expect," Walsh grinned. "And because sometimes you need to grab someone by the throat and explain exactly why they made you angry." The most successful student of human tactics was an unexpected one. Commander Zix Thara of the former Korathian Imperial Navy had volunteered to learn human fighting methods. The tall, pale alien with glowing bioelectric eyes was trying to understand the species that had defeated his empire. "I am still confused by your tactical philosophy," Zix Thara said to Morrison during one of their regular discussions. "Your methods appear to be based on randomness and emotional responses rather than logical analysis." "That's because logic is predictable," Morrison explained. And predictable enemies are easy to defeat. We win by being unpredictable. But how do you maintain unit cohesion without standardized procedures? Morrison thought for a moment. Have you ever watched children play together? They don't have procedures or protocols, but they still work as a team. They communicate through instinct and emotion rather than formal signals. Zixtharas' bioelectric eyes flickered thoughtfully. This explains why our adaptation matrices failed. We were trying to analyze childlike behavior with adult logic systems. Exactly. You were thinking too hard about it. The changes in galactic warfare went beyond just tactics. The entire philosophy of military service was shifting. Other species had always viewed war as a necessary evil to be conducted with cold efficiency. Humans had introduced the concept that fighting could be fun. Lieutenant Colonel Frank Cooper was now running the fighter pilot training program. His students came from dozens of different worlds, all trying to learn how to fly like drunk humans, having the time of their lives. The secret, Cooper told his latest class, is to enjoy yourself. If you're not having fun, you're doing it wrong. The enemy can't predict what you'll do next if you don't know what you'll do next. A young pilot from the Rigel system raised her hand. But sir, how can warfare be enjoyable? Is it not serious business? War is the most serious business there is, Cooper replied. That's exactly why you need to approach it with joy. Fear makes you predictable. Anger makes you predictable. But happiness? Happiness makes you dangerous. The results of human training were showing up across the galaxy. Korathian fleets that had been preparing to attack 3 more systems suddenly found themselves facing enemies they couldn't understand or counter. The USS Montana and her alien allies had used chaos formations to defeat a Korathian battle group. Near the Vega system, the enemy ships had actually retreated rather than face more human-trained opponents. The most remarkable change was in the Korathians themselves. After studying human tactics for months, they had begun to understand that their greatest strength had also been their greatest weakness. Their ability to adapt to any logical threat had made them vulnerable to illogical ones. We have been too rigid in our thinking, Admiral Morthek of the Korathian Navy admitted during a joint strategy session. Your species has taught us that adaptation requires flexibility of thought, not just biological evolution. Some Korathian ships were even beginning to incorporate human unpredictability into their own tactics. They couldn't completely abandon their biomechanical nature, but they were learning to use their adaptation abilities in chaotic rather than logical ways. The peace negotiations had been unlike anything in galactic history. Instead of formal, diplomatic procedures, the humans had insisted on informal discussions over shared meals. They had told jokes, shared stories, and somehow convinced a warrior empire to become their allies through the simple act of treating them like friends rather than enemies. Morrison received regular reports from across human space. The new doctrine was spreading faster than anyone had expected. Young officers who had grown up hearing stories about the Battle of New Providence were eager to try their own impossible tactics. The USS Enterprise, under Captain Mark Johnson, had recently defeated a pirate fleet by flying her ship upside down while playing polka music. The pirates had been so confused by the bizarre attack that they had surrendered without firing a shot. The USS Yorktown had ended a colonial rebellion by landing on the rebel planet and challenging their leaders to a series of sporting competitions. Instead of bombardment, the rebels had been so impressed by this unusual approach that they had agreed to peaceful negotiations. But perhaps the most important change was in how other species viewed humanity. Before the war, humans had been seen as a young, inexperienced race trying to prove they belonged among the stars. Now they were recognized as the species that had revolutionized warfare itself. Morrison looked out at the training exercises and smiled. Ships from dozens of worlds were flying in patterns that would have been considered insane just months earlier. They were learning that sometimes the best strategy was to have no strategy at all. The age of predictable warfare was over. The galaxy had learned to fight like humans, and nothing would ever be the same again. In the end, humanity had earned their place among the stars, not by becoming more like other species, but by being exactly what they had always been: stubborn, unpredictable, and utterly unwilling to give up when any sensible person would have. Surrendered. The Carathians had broken every fleet they had ever faced. But they had never faced a species that could turn their greatest weaknesses into weapons, or their defeats into victories through sheer bloody-minded refusal to accept the impossible.